I grew up going to a non-denominational church, and I grew up thinking I was Protestant. But a creator named Redeemed Zoomer has called that into question lately, and that's what we're going to talk about today on the Things You Don't Hear in Church podcast. My name is Derry.
And my name is Ethan, and make sure to go check us out on Instagram, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you guys find podcasts. We're probably there. The best way to help the show grow would probably be to sub on YouTube, follow on Instagram, and also message us there if you have questions. We'd love to answer them. And yeah, we are talking about our non-denominational churches, Protestant. Something I never thought I'd ever question in my life until Redeemed Zoomer brought up the point. Because I would also say, even now, I'm Protestant, but yet I don't go to a classic Protestant high church like a Methodist or Lutheran, I've gone to Anglican church a couple times, but I'm not a member. And I grew up inner city Pentecostal charismatic, so apparently I'm not Protestant. It's like
So this topic is.
I was gonna say it's like the Catholics kicked the Protestants out, and the Protestants kicked the non-denoms out. Apparently, at least Redeemed Zoomer is.
Yeah. So this topic is really applicable to me and Ethan because we're both sort of in this phase of like choosing a church to go to. We both have left YWAM in the last year. Ethan moved back to Detroit, and then I moved back to California, and we're both sort of deciding where we want to go to church. We both had a home church in Honolulu we went to outside of YWAM. That was a non-denominational church, and it was really great. But even while we were still in YWAM, we were kind of questioning, like, what is church to us? What do we value in it? What does the Bible say about it? And so we've had a lot of episodes this year on that topic. And this is another one of them. I think this is a really important one, actually. So we're going to talk about a lot of really good stuff here, not only about the Redeemed Zoomer topic, but I think that's a good jumping off place. As we're both kind of questioning, like, why do we go to church and what is good about it? We want to ask ourselves the question, like, is it important to go to a non-denominational church or to go to an actual denomination? What are the pros and cons of both of those things if we don't want to be Catholic or we don't want to be Orthodox or something like that? Do we want to stick with what we've grown up with, which is non-denominational? What are the cons of that? What are the pros of it? Yada, yada. So with that, we can play the clip from Redeemed Zoomer. We're just going to play like 30 seconds of this so we can get some of his arguments kind of queued up here, and then we'll go from there into some of our own thoughts on it.
So what does define Protestantism? It's actually really simple and obvious. It's just any church that comes from the Protestant Reformation. So even though there are a few debatable cases, it's an accurate and historically informed definition that allows you to compare institutions to institutions rather than just institutions to vague ideas. This definition is also necessary for determining what Protestant theology is. If any non-denominational church can be Protestant, then Protestantism can be easily strawmanned because it has no unifying theology. But if Protestantism is defined by specific institutions with a common origin, then there are official documents for each of them that you can reference when talking about what Protestant theology is. This is the only way to authoritatively correct misunderstandings about what Protestants believe. To understand why many of these groups are not Protestant, you have to understand they come from a completely different movement than the Protestant Reformation.
Okay, so, Derry, thoughts on that?
Yeah, so Redeemed Zoomer has two main points, I think, when he thinks that non-denoms aren't Protestant. He says that there's a theological difference, which for sure there is for most of the time. And then there's also an organizational difference, right? Like non-denoms most of the time are one-offs or non-denominational, and there's a lot of different ones of them, and they kind of just become their own denomination out of a name, but it's still sort of a new thing. Like the church has started in the last 50 years or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. And so they're not a part of the same organization. They don't share the same origins or traditions and stuff like that. So there's theological differences, but the origins are also different. They're not a part of the actual organization that reformed the church, right? Later on in the video, Redeemed Zoomer says that the reformers weren't trying to get rid of the Catholic Church. They were trying to reform it, right? They were trying to stay a part of it. He mentions that a lot of the reformers, a lot of our like Reformation fathers, were actually priests in the Catholic Church. So they were Catholic themselves, and they were trying to reform the church, not start a new church in entirety. And I think you could make arguments that like the Reformation churches that exist today and the mainline denominations are in fact new churches. Like they are not Reformation churches. like they're not the Catholic Church. But you can kind of argue back and forth on the semantics of that. Like maybe they're the church that stayed the same and the Catholic Church has deviated. I don't know what they would say to that. But I think that's Redeemed Zoomer's main argument, is that non-denoms aren't Protestant because Protestant hold a certain set of theologies that the Reformers held, and they were a part of organizations that were Reformers were a part of. And because non-denoms aren't a part of those organizations and don't hold the same theology, even though they affirm the same gospel, that might mean that they're Christian, but they're not Protestant because by definition, they didn't protest the Catholic Church and they didn't try to reform the Catholic Church. What do you think about that, Ethan?
Yeah, it's an interesting distinction, and I think no one can really disagree that most non-denoms, like he's right about the theology. Most non-denoms don't hold real presence, and they're clearly not part of. They're clearly not part of the churches that came from the Protestant Reformation, like the list that he showed right before we stopped watching. That was like Congregational Baptist. I mean, Baptists. There are Baptists out there, and most non-denoms, or in my opinion, a lot of non-denoms are just former Baptists in disguise or current. Like they still are Baptists. They just brand as non-denom. I know the non-denom that I've been going to for the last 2 weeks is formerly Baptist. So I'm like, you're not non-denom. You're just Baptist. Right. So, right. Which, I think that's fine. So I don't think that you could ever say like, oh, no. We do, like the non-denoms wouldn't disagree with anything he said. They would say, you're right. We don't believe the sacraments are like as serious or as grace. Means of grace. I don't believe in real presence. We obviously don't believe in the structure, or else they would be in the structure. Sure. Right. So now the problem is I'm uncomfortable saying that they're not Protestant because like Protestant, Eastern Orthodox, and Catholic are the main branches of Christianity. And maybe there's like a bunch of sub ones, like where would the Assyrian Church of the East fit? Something like that. I don't know. Where would the Coptic Church fit in that? So maybe it doesn't matter. And maybe it's just like, non-denoms are out there and not like out there like crazy, just like they exist out there and they're not Protestant. Some of them are out there and you shouldn't go to those ones. But I guess the next question then would be like, is that problematic? And should we care about that? Or should we be like, fine, cool, not Protestant, still going to heaven?
Right.
Yeah.
I think that would be Redeemed Zoomer's also his response. Like, like you're still going to heaven if you believe the gospel and you're part of a non-denominational church. So at the very beginning, that's kind of what we have to qualify. Like, it feels weird, like you were mentioning, to not be Protestant and be a part of a non-denom, because you feel like all of a sudden, if you've read church history, you're just not a Christian anymore, because you feel like Christianity is encapsulated by those, like generally those three categories of Protestant, Orthodox, and Catholic. And you're like, well, if I'm not a part of one of those three, like more historic branches, depending on which one you're talking about, more or less historic, like then I feel like I'm not Christian. And I think that is the knee-jerk reaction, but I don't think that it's true necessarily. Like if you believe the gospel, if you affirm the Nicene Creed, then you're Christian. That's great. So I don't think you have to question like your salvation or if you're following Christ. What you have to evaluate is if being Protestant is something that you want to be, and then why you want to be it, right? But maybe we're jumping ahead of ourselves. Do we need to address anything else about like if non-denoms are Protestant? Because I think I would say they're not. I don't think non-denoms are Protestant. I don't think you think that they're Protestant either. Like I can't think of a good argument for why they would be. Besides, it just feels weird.
Right. Besides, it does feel weird. I don't care if non-denoms say they're Protestant because it doesn't matter to me. I'm like, okay. Sure. Like it's like whatever. Most people think that just means not Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, like Redeemed Zoomer said. Right. So if people are like, I'm Protestant, I'm like, sure, it doesn't matter to me. If someone's concerned about it, I'm like, yeah, like you're saying, you're still saved. It's fine to have distinctions. If you want to be Protestant, you might want to like think about what that means and if he's right. The question is also like, is Redeemed Zoomer right? He could be wrong, and it could just be his opinion. And that's what we're kind of trying to dissect right now a little bit is like, can non-denoms be Protestant in some type of way? But at the end of the day, it's like, well, how much does this matter? because if we're all preaching the gospel, if we're all trying to get people saved, if we're all going to heaven, that might be okay. A way it might matter is because Christians have been doing Christianity for thousands of years, and there's ways we have done it. And schisming, as like people will say, or branching off and doing your own thing, has not been an encouraged idea. You know, even like the Reformation was not an intentional schism. It was like, we want to fix the Catholic Church. And then the Catholic Church kicked everybody out. And then like it did kind of start a snowball effect of people starting their own things. Maybe like, and then you got a bunch of different ways to have like Anglican, Presbyterian, Congregationalist. Like, and I don't think any of that's wrong. In my mind, I think having different expressions of Christianity makes sense because there's so many different cultures in the world, and I don't think that it's supposed to, that Christianity is supposed to look one way across all cultures as far as like the nitty gritty, right? Obviously, keep the gospel, baptize, Eucharist. That's like the top three. But if you're following that, then it's like, yeah, it makes sense that Christianity would grow so much as it expands, that different people believe different things, and it makes sense that they just then hang out with each other and those who they agree with. And therefore you get all these denominations. One thing I think, and this might be getting into a little bit of where you're trying to go in the future of this podcast, so if I'm getting ahead of myself, we can backtrack. But one thing I think is a valid question would be, is it wise to go to a non-denom where there doesn't seem to be a lot of structural accountability that has been tested for a couple hundred years, and going somewhere where there's not a lot of accountability in the leadership, where it's just like, this guy started the church and he, like, what he says goes, and there's not a lot of who do you go to? Like, if it's independent, because the non-denom I go to is like multi-site, and so they have many churches around the city, and so there's it's like probably the same problem, but it's a bigger church, so there's more accountability within the big church, but still has similar problems where like, okay, but the lead pastor, whoever's the head of that, who's going to challenge him? And maybe that's not a problem, because maybe you get that in every Protestant and Eastern Orthodox and Catholic church, where if someone's the leader of all, like, who's going to be who's going to keep them accountable? I'm kind of just thinking out loud now. One thing I do have beef with, though, that Redeem Zoomer said, is he lumped in Pentecostals with these restorationist group. The restorationist group, I think you could question if non-denoms come from restorationists. And so I could get into that beef, but I've been talking for a little bit. Is there anything you want to jump into before I get into that?
I think the point that you brought up is kind of a secondary issue for like, is Protestant or is non-denominational, are non-denominational churches bad in the first place? And we can get into that a little bit later, I think. I think we should try to just fully flush out like, are non-denoms Protestant first before we move on to anything else. Is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine.
The only pushback I can go ahead. Yeah.
I was gonna say in a short answer, it's fine if people say, it seems like if you're going to define Protestantism as those who came from the Protestant Reformation and still hold to those creeds, and non-denoms don't do that, then it doesn't seem like you're Protestant.
Yeah. One thing I can see some some denominational churches pushing back and saying, well, my denomination comes from a like mainline denomination. We're non-denominational, but we come from a denomination, but we wanted to reform the reformers. And so we didn't like this doctrine or that doctrine. Maybe they came from like a Reformed Baptist church, or they came from a Presbyterian church, and they didn't like one of the tenets of Calvinism. And so they wanted to just be Presbyterian, but they didn't want to be Calvinist or something like that. And so they became non-denominational, and they were just reforming the reformers. I couldn't point you to any specific non-denom church. But do you think that that would be a good like comeback at someone trying to say that they're not Protestant? Because technically they're just doing what the reformers did at the Catholic Church. And the reformers are saying, well, we're still a part of the historic church. Like, we didn't want to change we didn't want to like not be a part of the one true church. We just wanted to restore it to what it was before, and the Catholic Church changed. And so we're the true church now. And so this non-denom could say, well, we're just reforming something that we think also has gone astray. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a fair claim, because the problem is that most of these Protestant churches that he's talking about have gone astray, and they've gone woke, right? Like, how I just have this pulled up right now. Let's see. I mean, I don't know about anything about Congregationalist churches except I've been to two, but Methodists, they've gone woke. Baptists, I don't know if they have. Maybe some of them have. Anglicans, the Episcopal Church and the Anglicans, some of them have gone woke. That's why the ACNA started. Presbyterians, I think it was the PCA that went woke, or the PCA USA. I always get confused. And the Lutherans, they all went woke. So all of these mainline Protestant denominations, at least half of them on screen, on my screen, most of them have gone astray. So you do need to reform that. You need to reform that Reformed church. And that's a good thing. You should hold to the scriptures. And if you're reforming it in view of what the scriptures say, then that's fine. And if you branch off from that, I don't know if someone's trying to I think it's fine for the ACNA to be like, we're Anglican, but this other Anglican, the mainstream Anglicans have gone crazy. We're going to leave that and still retain Anglicanism and hold all the tenets of that. They wouldn't say they're non-denom. They're like, no, we are Anglican. We're just being doctrinal. Sure. So if that's fine for a whole group of people to do, then it seems like it would be okay for a one-off church to be like, no, you guys have gone off. We're not going to follow you. And my question would be to that church, why drop the name of your Protestant affiliation? Right. Why just totally cut the cord? I think it's fine to switch and leave when people are ungodly. But why drop the name would be my question.
100%. I would say they're not Protestant still if you're non-denom. Even if you're trying to reform a Reformed church, if you're dropping the name, like you said, if you're not trying to look like the original church that you came from, whatever mainline it was like, and then you're changing your theology. So in Redeem Zoomer's point, not that that's law or anything, but to his point, you're not a part of the original organization, and you're not a part of the theology tradition that they have. So you're probably not Protestant, but because you're just not reforming that original church that much, you're just making your own new thing. And so it depends on how much they changed their theology and the structure of the service. If the structure of the service was the same as whatever mainline they came from, and their theology was pretty much the same, they just didn't like Calvinism or something, right? And they just got rid of that. Then I'd be like, okay, cool. If you're still holding to most of the Protestant theology, and you're still trying to hold to some semblance of the original denomination, I don't have a big problem with that. But at the same time, it's kind of semantics there. For me, I don't think it matters if you're a Protestant or not. In my mind, it's almost worse if you are Protestant. And that kind of sounds weird, but it's why are you so obsessed with being a part of the Catholic Church or being tied to the Catholic Church? It means a lot to you for some reason. There's a proverbial you there, not a specific person. But why does it matter that much that you need to be a part of the Catholic Church? And I think someone who's from a mainline that cares about being Protestant a lot would say, well, it's because we want to be a part of the one true church, right? And if the Catholic Church was the one true church and we had to reform them, then we are a part of the one true church now that Christ established. And I think that's the next kind of big topic we got to get into of should you want to be Protestant, and why would you want to be Protestant if you think you should be Protestant? I think the main reason you would want to be Protestant is because you think they're the one true church that you need to be a part of. Not that you can't find salvation outside of it, but that's the church that Christ established. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I'm not saying I believe that. I'm saying that's why someone might want to be Protestant.
Right. I mean, Lutherans are like that, right? I've heard Lutheran interviews with Lutherans, and they're like, we want the unity of the church. We want to Rome to repent and have restoration. I guess that takes on that goes down the road of what do you think the church is? What do you think Jesus himself instituted? And if you believe that Christ instituted one actual one institutional body that has laws and you're not allowed to change, and because that's what the Catholics believe, right? They're oh, he established his kingdom on earth. The Catholics I learned this week that Catholics look at their church as the kingdom of God, and that's why they have more governing systems, and that's why they have the Pope and different bishops. They organize their church structure like a government of a country, because they're oh, we are a kingdom, and that's why you can't schism, because it's not like someone could go start America off because they don't like America. They're not going to go we're going to reform America and go leave and start America somewhere else, we'd be like, well, America still exists. But that is a whole question of like, what do you even think the church is? I don't believe that Jesus intended for it to be one institutional thing. Like, it is an institution. Like, Christianity is an institution. There are laws, there are rules. The scripture lays it out. It's Jesus, the apostles' teachings, like that. But it's not like it's not. I think God meant it to be kind of how we see in the evangelical non-denom space, where Christianity has the freedom to look differently in different cultures. And I think if God wanted some super strict hierarchy like the Catholics have, or the Eastern Orthodox, and even some of the Protestants, although to the credit of the Protestant high churches and denominations, they don't have that strict of hierarchy. Like, it's not like the other traditions. If he wanted that, he would have told us very clearly. Like, church structure is like one of the most important things that we need in this world as Christians, and like how to do church right. And the New Testament talks about how to do church right. It talks about like lifting up spiritual songs and hymns, laying hands on each other, the Eucharist, the baptisms, and holding fast to the apostles' teachings and Jesus' teachings. And if you're doing that, then it seems like you can do that anywhere. And then the question also for Protestants who might want to be like back to Rome for your original question, like eventually have all the Christians under one title, one body of name, then it would be like that you probably believe some type of apostolic succession where you think that spiritual transmission can be traced as like hyper intentional, so like only by the laying on of hands. And so if you believe, so basically to sum it up, it depends what you believe about Jesus's intentions for his people as a church. I think when Jesus says my kingdom is spiritual, and if it was physical, my people would fight for me when he's arrested, I think that kind of tells us how it's supposed to look. I don't think we're supposed to have necessarily like, I don't know, we're supposed to be Christians and spread the gospel and create more Christians. But does it have to be like a specific one branch of Christianity? I don't think so. I think the diversity is actually pretty great because you can find people who agree with you. And for unity purposes, if you're like, I don't want to fight with that person, you don't have to. Now, some people might highly disagree with that. It might offend some people, but that's okay. That's what an opinion is.
If you think about like Mark 9, like Jesus has a pretty clear example where the disciples come up to him and they're like, hey, like these guys over here are casting out demons in your name, and we told them to stop because they don't follow us, and they didn't. And Jesus is like, good, like they shouldn't stop. Like, don't tell them to stop. Like, anyone who casts out demons in my name, like they're doing something good. And so, I mean, you might say that that's out of context, but the context is that people are basically doing Christian stuff and not following the disciples. And Jesus is like, yeah, cool. Like, they're doing something in my name. Like, they follow me. Like, they don't have to necessarily be following you to follow me. And you could get into some real bad theology with that. So I am saying that there is context to that, but just as a loose example, like maybe it's not supposed to be just one organization. Maybe you don't have to be Protestant. Maybe you could just be a Christian and have good theology, and you're still saved and you're still a Christian. You don't have to be tied to this Reformation label to be a Christian. Now, there might be reasons why you would be tied to that, for historic reasons, for theological reasons. We can get into those things in a second, but I think that there is a wider net of what it means to be called a Christian than just being Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty easy to hold to the apostles' teachings. Like, some people would be like, one of the classic pop culture attacks on Protestantism, and maybe from even on non-denoms even more so, is like, sola scriptura is actually solely your interpretation. And it's like, well, no, like the Bible can be understood. You don't need like a ton of knowledge to read the Bible and know what it says. You need historical context, sure. And there's things you want to get right and you need to do some more study, but it's pretty self-explanatory kind of as far as what Christianity is supposed to look like. That's why every Christian of every tradition rejects Jehovah's Witness and Latter-day Saints. Like, if it would, because they claim to have the scriptures too, and they do have their interpretation, and every Christian is like, you guys are crazy. That's why everyone calls oneness Pentecostals crazy, because we can read the scriptures and see what they're doing and be like, that's wrong. So even though there's debate between like predestination and what that looks like and what hell will look like and do the gifts continue or not, it's like that's an in-house conversation, and every Christian can have arguments back and forth about why they want to believe what they want to believe, and they're naturally going to hang out with those who believe with them. But all of us agree in that camp. Everyone who's like cessationist, continuationist, free will, Calvinist, whatever, everyone who like fights about those issues is unified when you talk about Jehovah's Witness, Oneness Pentecostals, and Mormons. We're all like, those guys are wrong. And so this idea that you have to be attached to this massive body in order to have the right interpretation, and it's actually really wrong if you don't. I think there's better arguments to make for why you should probably be Protestant instead of non-denom or whatever the other label not Protestant would be. There's better reasons to be Protestant, but that accusation just doesn't hold up in my opinion.
Yeah. Maybe time to move to some more exciting questions about should you be non-denom or should you want to be Protestant? Do you want to go there, Ethan?
Yes. Hold on. My app shut down, so I'm still here. Let me just switch my camera over.
You care about theology. You care about believing what the historic churches believed, and you care genuinely, about like what the Bible teaches in actuality, and you want to get it right. And you're like, okay, should I maybe go to a Protestant church and actually want to be Protestant? Like, what are the valuable parts about being Protestant? And maybe what are the valuable parts about being non-denominational that you might want to keep? I think those are two good things to go over so you can decide for yourself, like, do I need to keep going to a denominational church? Maybe, and this is an interesting little thing God might call you to do, maybe if you dislike some of the things in your non-denominational church, God's calling you to do some work with your non-denominational church and get it to believe some of the things that historic church actually taught and believed. I think that's something that the Lord's doing in a lot of non-denominational churches, that he is kind of doing and using the fluidity of the platform and sort of changing their theology back to what it used to be in a lot of the reformers. I think that's really cool because you save some of the good parts of what it is to be or to not be Protestant, to be non-denom, and you kind of add the good parts of the theological traditions. So getting a little ahead of myself, but Ethan, can you think of any things that are good about non-denoms, reasons why people would want to go to non-denoms over going to typical mainline churches?
Yeah, I would say they probably are the easiest or most easily accessible for new believers, as far as their expression is very relevant to culture. So they offer the opportunity for people to walk in and immediately understand, like, oh yeah, this song is saying these lyrics, I can get down with that, or I understand this. So it's more, it's better for the culture around them for reaching people. They do the most evangelism. They provide some of the most community. The biggest churches are mostly non-denom. It's not like the mainline Protestants are probably growing, but they offer a lot of Christian community. They do a lot of good ministry to the community. And there's enough non-denoms that you can find good Bible teaching. So those would be the first ones off the bat. But before we continue, I want to talk about a little bit. I wanted to mention this because I wrote it down.
Ooh, segment.
What's that?
I said, sponsored segment.
Sponsored segment. Our sponsor's brought to you by, no. One of the things I said I had beef with Redeemed Zoomer earlier on is he lumped in, we can talk about the Restorationist movement because that's where he said that non-denoms come from. I don't know how you quantify that, but then he also lumped in Pentecostals with not Protestant, and that's actually questionable because, believe it or not, Protestants have ties to the Reformation. You ready to hear this?
You mean Pentecostals have ties
to the
Reformation?
What did I say, Protestants?
You said Protestants have time.
Oh, yeah, Pentecostals. Sorry, my bad. Too many P words. Pentecostals have ties to the Protestant Reformation. So from the Reformation came the Anglicans. The Anglicans, this guy named John Wesley was an Anglican, and he started Methodism. And out of Methodism grew this thing called the Holiness Movement, which gave way to the Azusa Revival, which is responsible for a number of Pentecostal denominations today. So, obviously different than oneness Pentecostals, but Pentecostals, at least a number of those Pentecostal denominations, can claim Protestant because they came from Anglicans.
Maybe there's some jumps there, but
yeah, of course.
they kind of have a line to it a little bit.
Yeah, of course. I was being more cheeky where I'm like, hey, we can trace this.
Hey, yeah, that's funny. I agree with your list of reasons why you'd want to be in a non-denom. For sure, there's unity and there's like this fluidity that's really cool. I think one thing that's really cool is when you're outside of the like definition of Protestant itself and you're just calling yourself a Christian. That's kind of like a cringy thing people do today that people make fun of, where people are like, what denomination are you? And they're like, I'm just Christian. And you're like, all right, you're not a dom, gotcha. But and like that is a little cringy. But that's because of like how the person will talk about theology. Like the person who says, oh, I'm just Christian, or like, oh, I just read the Bible, like really doesn't know what they're talking about when it comes to theology most of the time. But hey, that person reads the Bible a lot, and I love that, right? So I'm not trying to clown on that person, but it's kind of a common trope these days for a certain type of Christian, which is okay. But it just gets a little bit cringy. But there is a little cool part to that sentiment where you're like, hey, there's this broader umbrella known as Christianity that I think Christians and Protestants can kind of share in their view. And I think I've heard Gavin Ortland and Redeemed Zoomer say this before, where they say like Orthodox think that they're the one true church, and they have doubts about Protestants and Catholics. And Catholics think the same thing, and they have doubts about Protestants and Orthodox. But Protestants are free to believe that Orthodox, Catholics, and Christians outside of Protestantism are all Christian and are all going to heaven. And so there's a broader sense in which Christianity has a broader net and is encapsulated in the wholeness of like a one true church, encapsulating all 3 or 4 of those different streams of Christianity, where you get kind of a broader and cool type of unity in that perspective. And so I think if Protestants can believe that, then you get even more of that in just calling yourself Christian and not even having to be like a reformer or being Protestant. I think that's kind of cool. So that's another kind of plus I see for non-denoms. All the fluidity is also really cool. It's really easy for them to adjust to the good parts of culture. Of course, we don't want to adjust to look like the world and that part of the culture. But let's say you're going to start a church in India. You're going to go start a Calvary Chapel or whatever church you're a part of, right? Like you're not going to start the same Calvary Chapel that Southern California has in India because it's not going to work and people aren't going to go. You have to assimilate to the culture and to what values those people have spiritually that God gave them that are good values, so that they will come, right? You have to not adjust the gospel, but you have to see what part of the gospel is going to be effective to them in their culture, because they value different things than we value, right? That may seem offensive to some people, but it's very true. If you're ever doing evangelism cross-culturally, every culture values different things. Some cultures really value shame and honor. Some really value families. Some really value hard work. Like there's just very different values that cultures have. And so there's different parts where the gospel takes effect in each one of those cultures. And so it's really easy for non-denoms to go and assimilate their culture of whatever church they have to the culture of the people and be very effective there, which is why, like Ethan mentioned, non-denoms in missions and in churches have really high attendances, and have a lot of people who go to them and spread really quickly and have tons of converts. Like out of all the converts that have converted in the last 100 years, like I think probably not most of them, but the majority, over 50% of them would probably be non-denominational. Like we are really, really good at bearing fruit and seeing people come to know the Lord. Now, maybe a Protestant or a Catholic or something would argue, well, that's just because of seeker-sensitive churches and they're not actually real Christians. They're just people you've co-opted into getting to your church because you have a whole bunch of cool lights and smoke and stuff. And for sure, there are some people that do go to church for that reason, but I'm not a giant fan of questioning someone's salvation, right? And saying like, well, I don't know if you're coming here with pure intentions. Like, I'm not going to question why someone's going to church, right? That would be something for their pastor to do, and more on a one-by-one individual case basis. So I'm going to count those people as Christians, just generally for me. And so I don't have a problem with that. So there's, I think without a doubt, like Protestants, or not Protestants, non-denoms have tons of fruit and are really good at contextualizing the gospel, the culture that they're in, so that people can understand correctly who God is and come to know him. Like Ethan said, the barrier to the barrier to access the gospel is very low for a lot of people when it comes to non-denoms. So those are some good reasons why people should go, I think, to non-denoms. Is there anything you want to add to that, Ethan, or should we talk about why you shouldn't go to a non-denom?
Yeah, we can move on to why we think we should not, or at least we should be hesitant, maybe.
Some problems with non-denoms.
Probs with the non-denoms.
Oh, if you're a Redeemed Zoomer, this is the part you're going to want to skip to.
Where do we start? Oh my god. Okay, so this is one of the I'll pose this question as the first jumping off point, and then you talk some more. We talked
Women
about
in
this
authority. That's the first point.
Oh my gosh. You got problems with the Anglicans then.
Yeah.
Anglicans are moving in that direction, and not the woke ones, the ACNA. Pretty solid.
Ooh.
Anyways, what was I going to say? Oh, this is the question I asked you the other week when we were talking about this topic. If you have the option to go to a good historical Protestant church that you agree with their theology on, or a non-denom, like all things being equal, non-denom or historical Protestant, my gut instinct right now in my journey is I probably want to go to the historical non-denom. And the reason is I think there's value in being tied to a stream of Christianity that's been around and can trace its roots very far back, because I think it shows a sense of stability. Whereas a non-denom...
What non-denom are you thinking about? Because you
What's
said
that?
historic non-denom.
I said historic non-denom?
Yeah. I was confused
Sorry,
by that.
it's been a work day. Historic Protestant.
It's okay. Okay. Good.
I sat at this other desk to my left here all day on Zoom meetings, and then took a 30-minute break and hopped on this podcast. So my brain's fried.
All good.
Okay, sorry. I meant a historic Protestant church. If you have all things being equal, historic Protestant church and a non-denom, theology's fine. Both offer community, everything you want. I think you should probably opt for the historic non-denom for the basis that it is more historic. It's been around longer. It's more likely, therefore, then to remain longer. Where a lot of things with non-denoms is that they might not be like, you might have to question how confident you can be that they'll be around in 100 years or so. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that?
Yeah. I mean, it's so hard to say, because I feel like I can't say unless you go to the church, because there's so much that goes into choosing a church. So it's really case by case basis. I'd say that's good wisdom for the most part. Like, if that's all I know about the church, then that's probably what I'm choosing. Like, if you just have 2 church names in your hand and I have to choose one to go to from now on, I think that's solid.
Yeah. I do think. Okay, actually, you go ahead and start with the problems you see in non-denom, and then I'll comment afterwards.
Okay, yeah. I think the first problem with a lot of non-denoms, and as I go into this list, as we talk about this, I currently think where I stand is that I want to go to a non-denom. That's what I think currently. I think that's what God's calling me to, but I haven't totally made up my mind. So that's just what I'm prefacing this with. I'm saying I see problems. I'm not abandoning it, though, necessarily. Okay, so just know that as I go forward. Arguments against going to a non-denominational church. There is no standard of theology when it comes to a non-denom church. I have to go to the pastor of every non-denom church that I go to. Like, if you're going to church shop, right? Which is something you couldn't do if you were, say, a Presbyterian. There's going to be one Presbyterian church in your town, and that's the church you're going to go to. You can't church shop unless you just decide to become a Methodist or something, right?
Unless you move to Detroit. Presbyterians are multiplying like crazy here.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, it's great.
So unless you wanted to drive farther, like if you wanted to drive an hour or half an hour or something out of the way, then for sure you could go to a different Presbyterian church. But typically, there's going to be one church in your denomination in your town. if there even is a church of that denomination in your town for you to go to, right? And when you go to that denomination, like, you're going to know what they believe theologically. There might be some little things here and there that the pastor thinks differently on, or how he interprets differently, but generally you're going to understand what they believe theologically. Every different non-denom you go to is going to believe something different, and it's going to take a long time unless you have like a sit-down meeting with the pastor and you ask him every theological question there is. It's going to take you a long time to figure out what they actually believe. So there's no like one standard of theology, which can get a little wacky, right? Which is why a lot of non-denominational churches have gone off the rails, become cults or spawned cults, or have had pastors go in very like heretical directions, right? Like, I feel like a different non-denom pastor goes viral every week for some crazy hot take, like the pastor of Mosaic or whatever. Like, every week I see a new like clip of him saying something. I'm like, have you read the Bible? I'm so confused about how you got to that conclusion.
I've never
About,
listened to
like,
him
what did you
before.
believe? You have. You just don't know you have. He's like the Mexican guy that is all over Instagram right now.
Really?
Anyways, he's the guy who says that hell is outside of time, and Jesus descended to hell after he died on the cross and freed everyone in hell. And so because hell is outside of time, he freed all of the captives in hell. And so everyone's going to go to heaven in the end. Yeah, for all time.
I've never heard of it. I just looked up this guy's face. I've never seen him.
Yeah, that's a new argument, but that's also incredibly wrong. Like,
he's just making things up, bro. That's just crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy. So he says like crazy stuff all the time.
He's doing Bible fanfic, bro. He's like, what if this happened?
Literally. So what if this thing that isn't true was true? Like, that's literally what he said. People like Bill Johnson having very niche, non-orthodox views on parts of the Trinity that get really, really, really weird. Like, you just get into a lot of really weird theological nuances that border on heresy, even cross the line of heresy, when you have no standard of theology to put yourself up against, right? Because if a Presbyterian or a Baptist or something, as long as it's like a kind of mainline Baptist, makes a mistake theologically, you have a whole bunch of elders and pastors from other churches and boards that you have to answer to, and they can correct you and say, hey, this actually isn't true. This isn't what we believe. You need to teach this. Which, hey, maybe you could say that there's some cons to that too. Maybe there are. But there's for sure some pros to having that accountability, which is really good. So that's one thing that I see that's a problem. I have other things, but I'll let you talk for a second.
Yeah, that's good. There are definitely, it's definitely more likely that an individual non-denom will get into weird spiritual stuff. But then someone could take a look at the Protestant main lines and be like, yeah, you guys are ordaining like pro-LGBTQ trans people as priests. So, sure. Maybe I would rather go to a weird non-denom that's got, maybe I just would. If I had to choose either, I'd probably just choose my prayer closet. if I had to choose
Can't
between
do that.
heresy and heresy, I'm going to choose neither.
Sure.
Yeah, so I think my first thing I have written down for a problem with non-denoms is generally, this is all generally speaking, because you can't, there's so many of them. Generally, they're not focused on long-term discipleship. They're mostly focused on getting people in the door and converting them there, which kind of takes a whole different approach to what Christianity or what church is for. I don't believe church is for the newcomer. I think church is for the discipleship of believers. Now, people can get saved in church. That's great. But we shouldn't try to use the church as a vehicle for evangelism. People should be evangelizing. And the church should be sponsoring events like helping the poor and stuff like that. And doing things that are evangelistic, but not Sunday morning. Sunday morning is to equip the believers and be unified around the Lord's Supper, which I think is great. So I think generally the fact that they're less focused on long-term discipleship is problematic. That's probably why we're seeing people leave them and go to more high churches, because there's like a long-term view of discipleship there. I feel like, and this might be offensive, I feel like generally non-denoms have a low standard of theology and low expectation for the congregant member and what they believe. Whenever I've gone to more high churches, it seems like the average person I talk to there is way more serious and deep in their theology, and I can like have a stimulating conversation with them. Whereas if I go to a non-denom, it's more like these people are more probably into pop culture, maybe just different desires. And so I don't want to insult anyone. I'm just thinking like the people at the Presbyterian churches or the Anglican churches I go to are more able to engage in higher level theological conversations than the non-denom people I talk to. Just my own personal observation. I could be totally wrong about the general consensus. Maybe I'm picking the wrong people.
What are you saying is like you don't like the seeker-sensitive side of non-denom churches, right?
Yeah, I think it has a low standard of Christian living.
For sure.
I think
it seems like
Go ahead.
It seems like in a lot of seeker-sensitive churches, it leads to the second thing you said, which is a low standard of theological competence in a lot of people, to where it's hard to tell if people that go to that church are Christian because the bar is so low for entry, where you're like, if you ask that person, hey, what do you think about Jesus being God? Or what do you think about sexual ethics? Or this or that thing? They could have any sort of answer because the church hasn't taught on it or they don't address it ever. So 100% I agree with you. And that's not every non-denom church, but that's for sure spawned in non-denom churches, like the seeker-sensitive movement in general.
Yeah, there was one I went to where I went to because you mentioned like if you want to know what they believe, you got to go to their church. I'm like, you got to go talk to the pastor. I'm like, I get that. And so I went to one class, and this is just it's sad. It had so much potential. But this one class at this church I went to, I asked like they were all about like, we don't like to get too much in the weeds on denominations or this or that. We want to be about the main thing. We want to be about Jesus. And I'm like, that sounds great. And then I was like, do you guys believe in more of a memorial or a real presence view and this and that? And it almost seemed like it offended the leadership that I asked. And then they kind of dismissed it and were like, oh, we can talk afterwards. We don't want to get too much into it. But he's like, personally, I'd take a more of a spiritual presence view. He's like, but the church doesn't have an official stance on it. And we also do practice open communion. So we think anyone who's taking communion, whether they're Christian or not, that is them saying yes to Jesus of some kind. And then he's like, we'll talk after. But I was just like, oh my gosh. Like, and I could tell that like, obviously it was like a who are we class. So maybe the people there were like, they're not, maybe I shouldn't expect them to know about like real presence, spiritual presence. But some of the people we talked to were like, oh yeah, we've been going here for a year. We just finally made it to the class. And I'm like, and you don't, oh, that's interesting. Or if I just go to any non-denom church and just talk to someone like, actually that might not be fair though. Cause I've talked to Presbyterians about the Eucharist and what they believe. And they've been like, oh, I actually don't know what Presbyterians believe. I should go back and look at my membership class. So maybe I'm being too hard. I might be being too hard. You got some people who really care and some people who don't care in both. So we can move on from that. One thing I think I think the non-denoms could get better at is being tied to the church calendar. I didn't know a church calendar existed until a few years ago when our friends started going to more Anglican churches. And I was like, what? I was like, Christians have been having their own calendar for like thousands of years. And there's like, we look at the whole calendar year as a spiritual thing of shaping us. I was like, that's amazing. How come no one's talking about this? Turns out they are, just not in the churches I was at. So I feel like we're missing out on so much possibility of deep, rich growth when we aren't having a high care for deep theology. We're not focused on long-term discipleship, and we're not tied to the church calendar. It's just like, it just seems like we're off in this vast sea of like, we're in this big giant ocean going through the waves, trying to do it ourselves, when it's like, there's a fleet of ships over there that have done it before that are solid and know how to do it. So why would we not go that way to like more Protestant stuff?
My non-denom that I grew up going to had the church calendar. It was a chocolate calendar you got every Christmas.
Oh my God. Was it actually like a church calendar? Like you went through the season?
No, it's just an Advent calendar.
Oh, Advent. Yeah. And then also finally, the biggest concern I have for non-denoms and my biggest hesitation is that they're not grounded in anything. And I don't know how you get around that. Like, if it's true that, hey, this guy just wanted to start a church, like one of the churches we went to here, they came and he like already took over a church. He's technically part of the denomination, the church is, but they functionally are non-denom. And he's like, and as they're talking about what they believe and why they do these practices, it was mostly all like, we didn't like this, so we don't do this. We didn't like this at this church, so we don't do this. It was all like their whole belief structure was a response of what they didn't like in other churches. So they just were doing the antithesis, which I'm like, that's not a good idea to do. But I'm like, yeah, I don't know if I like the idea of just anyone starting a church because they have a disagreement and they quote unquote feel a call, which is like, I believe God can call people. And if God calls me to the ministry and calls me to a non-denom, I'll do it. And people have the same concern. Like, Ethan, we can't falsify that. I'm like, you're right, but I have this conviction, so I have to follow it. I understand people are responsible with their convictions. But I do think it's a big problem where it's like, if you're called to ministry, is it possible that you could just go to a Protestant church, like just a standalone non-denom that's not grounded or rooted in anything, that doesn't have, it's basically based mostly on like, oh, this guy started it and that's what we're doing? It just doesn't seem wise to me when there's an ocean of value and help and accountability in other areas.
That's very good. That's true. I agree with most of that. It's like a lot of non-denoms don't value what the disciples valued, and what it's really funny. Like, if you asked me what tradition looks most like the early church, I would say non-denoms. Like, a lot of non-denoms meet in houses, and a lot of them have small churches, and a lot of them practice the gifts, like a lot of the first century church did. But it's so funny how like they look so much like them, but in so much of the deeper traditions that the early church did, like how they cared about baptism and how they cared about the Eucharist, those churches just don't care at all about those things. Like, they'll do it every once in a while, and someone after being a Christian for 2 years will eventually get baptized when they feel like it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's so interesting. Like, they care so much about the early church and what it looked like, and they do such a good job of looking like the early church, except for in the traditions that are like some of the oldest and deepest rooted. It's like they take half of it and they throw out the other half, which is really funny, that like the other half is what the denominational churches threw out. Like, they take that part. That's just kind of funny. I don't know. The last thing, though, that I see in non-denom churches that could be problematic is that a lot of them can easily be misled, and fall apart based off of one charismatic leader, right? Like, it's really easy for an entire church to fall apart, either because there was a scandal with one leader and now the church doesn't exist anymore, or like it disbands or goes and turns into a few different smaller churches, or it just slowly loses popularity and people leave because a community is not there anymore, or whatever charismatic leader you had there moved on, or has stopped being as charismatic, or has gotten older, or something like that. Like, so much of the church's health and longevity is tied to an individual and how popular that individual is, or the people that go there and how liked those people are, rather than what that church stands for and believes in. It's almost like a bad marriage, where like a denominational church would be the image of a good marriage, where it's like, it doesn't necessarily matter how nice that person's being, right? What matters is that you committed to that person and you go there because they share your values, right? Like, you saw someone and you're like, I'm going to commit to this person and these are my values. And then when that person changes, or when they're not the same way they were before, or they get a little older or something, all things that would maybe make a bad marriage fall apart or make a non-denom church fall apart, you still have that loyalty and commitment that Christ asks us to have, like he has to the church in a denominational church. So just another smaller part that I think can be problematic for some non-denoms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that video you sent the other day that's been circling by that guy Noah, where he talked about, if I could build the perfect denomination, I would have this, this, and this, is spot on, because, we would love the historic continuity that Protestant high churches have, or mainline Protestants have. We would love the evangelism and love for worship and zeal in worship that non-denoms have, and evangelism that non-denoms have. And so there's good and bad in both, for sure. And for every, I could go and critique high churches as well for all these, or mainlines for all these 100%. Things as well. We're just not doing that this episode. But yeah, whether you're non-denom or you go mainline Protestant, I really think it comes down to, in your heart, you have to determine what your conviction is, because that's the only thing you're going to be held accountable to. And that's kind of where I land with everything, right? We are going to stand before God for how we responded based on what we knew and the convictions that we felt were from the Lord in our heart. We're not going to stand before God for like, I don't know, like, oh, this person made a convincing argument and I was nervous, so I just did it to be safe. It's like, well, if you're a Christian and you believe you're born again, you've been following Jesus for a while, then there's an aspect where you have to listen to the leading of the Lord in your heart. And, people say like the heart's deceitful above all else, so don't listen to it. It's like, yeah, to a degree, sure. But I think a Christian can know what's an ungodly heart desire and a godly heart desire. And that's the biggest thing, right? And so we can't compromise on our convictions. That's what we're going to stand before God on. There's if the Roman Catholic Church is correct, and I stand before God one day and he's like, you should have submitted to Rome, I would have been like, sorry, like, no, everything in my being when I looked at it was not believing it was the right way to go. And I think the Lord would be merciful enough to recognize that and see that and have mercy. We're not rejecting Jesus or the divinity of Jesus. So you're still Christian. You just got to figure out how you think Christianity should look and what's the highest priority. Is community the highest priority? Is being in line with history a high priority to you? But ultimately, God looks at the heart, and ultimately we do know as well that true worshipers must worship in spirit and truth. So if you're doing that, you're probably fine.
Yeah. If I could say anything at the end of this episode, which I can because it's my podcast, I would say take a page out of Redeem Zoomer's book, right? And he started this thing called the Reconquista, where he's taking back the mainline denominations from like the more progressive theology that they have come to have. If you sat and listened to this episode and you're like, wow, like non-denoms are so bad, I don't like them, there's so many things that can go wrong with them, and you're kind of mad at them right now, or you've been thinking about Protestantism and what it means and all that kind of stuff, I would encourage you to think not only negatively about it and recognize the bad things with it, but there's a reason that God has allowed non-denom churches to have so much fruit, right? Like non-denom churches have thrived both overseas and in America for the last 50 years or so, like since the Jesus movement, kind of. And there's a reason for that. Like they haven't been devoid of God and the Spirit. Like God has used them and brought probably millions of people to know him through them. So it's not like he's not moving and working, and not like he doesn't love the non-denominational church. And so maybe God would ask you to be a part of the non-denominational church for all of its problems, to reform it in some kind of way. Maybe that's bringing a deeper theological education. Maybe that's bringing a more solid structure or value for tradition or something. Maybe God's not asking you to do that, but at least it's something to examine and not just throw out what God has used in the past because you're dissatisfied with something, right? So we want to think seriously about these things and maybe talk to your pastor about it, right? I think pastors, oftentimes from the pastors I know, are very disappointed in their congregations because they became pastors because they're passionate about the Lord, and they thought they were going to be leading a group of people that were also passionate about the Lord. And oftentimes it's like trying to get people that don't care about Christianity every week to care about it, because people just aren't that serious in church a lot of the time, and they just want their pastor to be serious and come to church on Sunday and try to feel better or something, and then they'll go home and just act however they want to act. And pastors a lot of times are very sad by the passion in their church. And so if you go and talk to your pastor and you're like, hey, like these are some of the things that I think our church should care about, I think a lot of pastors, if you do it in the right way and not in like a you're terrible and I'm critiquing you kind of way, but you do it in like a hey, I care about the church and like these are things that I think we should value kind of way, I think a lot of pastors will be stoked to hear that you actually care about what God's doing in the church and how you could be a part of it. And so something to think about, something to pray about. God is using non-denoms. He's using mainline churches. He's, in my opinion, using Orthodox and Catholic churches. And you need to pray about where God wants you to be a part in that stream or tradition, where he has you, and what difference you can make in being an active part of Christianity. So, yeah, anything else you want to say for this episode, Ethan?
No, that's great. I would just make the observation that everything you just said for non-denoms, you can stay and make it better. You can see the things that aren't good and see what God used in the past. You can ironically apply to the mainline Protestants too and see how God has used them and also the ways they need to reform. And so whichever path you choose, be committed to bringing godliness and making it better and helping the people around you be more serious about Christ as well.
Sounds good. Well, guys, hopefully you enjoyed this episode. We're going to have more episodes on similar topics to this. We're going to have some good guests coming up. We have some controversial guests coming up. So stay tuned for some fun episodes in the future.
All right. See you guys.